Patricia Johnson entered the courthouse on a crisp fall morning with a sense of calm that masked the turmoil she often felt deep inside. She had learned long ago that the world would judge her based on her appearance and not on her character, and so she had grown accustomed to facing the world with a quiet strength. She had no choice but to carry on with the weight of expectations upon her shoulders. She was a black woman in a small town with a past filled with struggles few people understood. Yet today, she had come for something simple, a traffic violation that had been dismissed as a mistake, one she was sure could be resolved easily enough. The courthouse was modest, nothing like the imposing structures seen in larger cities, but there was a sense of order and authority that filled the air. Patricia made her way to the front desk where she signed in and was given a ticket number for her case. She moved toward the waiting area and sat down alone as a handful of other people quietly awaited their turn. The murmur of voices filled the room, but it all felt distant to Patricia. Her mind often wandered back to the years she spent in the military, years of service that had shaped her into the woman she was today. She had served with honor and distinction, earning medals and commendations for her work as a logistics officer during her time in the armed forces. It had been a time of both triumph and hardship. She had worked tirelessly alongside men who often doubted her abilities, not because she wasn't capable, but because she was a black woman in a field dominated by men and even fewer women of color. But Patricia had shown them all that she could do the job as well as anyone else. And in some cases, better. She had learned to keep her emotions in check, to rise above the constant battle to prove herself. As she waited her turn for the case to be called, she watched the judge on the bench. He was an older man with sharp features and a stern expression. His name was Judge Ronald Hayes, and from the stories she had heard from others, he was known for being tough yet fair. He had a reputation for issuing fines quickly and without hesitation, and from the looks of it, he wasn't going to make an exception for her either. When her name was called, Patricia stood and walked calmly to the front of the courtroom. Her heart beat steadily in her chest. She had been in rooms like this before, but it still always felt like walking into a storm. Her gaze met Judge Hayes's, and for a moment, there was nothing personal in his eyes, just the detached scrutiny of a man who had seen too many cases pass through his courtroom to care about the individual stories behind them. Patricia briefly explained her situation. The traffic violation was a simple mistake, a miscommunication with her GPS system. But before she could finish her explanation, Judge Hayes waved his hand dismissively, as though he had already decided her fate. He glanced at her record before making his ruling, and without much more than a brief comment, he issued her a fine far steeper than what she had anticipated. Patricia stood there frozen for a second, but the shock quickly passed. Her face remained impassive. She knew this was how it worked in a place like this. She would pay the fine and move on. It was just one more reminder that no matter what she had done or achieved in her life, the world would always find a way to see her through the lens of judgment. She wasn't sure if she was angry or resigned, but as she left the courtroom, her heart was heavy and full of questions. Patricia walked out of the courthouse, the cold air hitting her face as she stepped into the crisp autumn day. She stood there for a moment, just outside the courthouse doors, taking in the world around her. Her mind felt heavy, not because of the fine she had just been handed, but because of the deep sense of injustice that had settled within her. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Throughout her life, people had often underestimated her, misjudged her, and made assumptions about who she was based on the color of her skin and the fact that she was a woman. But this felt different. She had served her country with honor, had worked harder than most just to be seen as equal, and still, here she was, being dismissed as nothing more than a small mistake in the court's vast caseload. She adjusted the straps of her bag on her shoulder and started walking slowly down the street. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step echoing in the quiet town. As she walked, she couldn't help but think back to her days in the military. It seemed like a lifetime ago, yet every moment of her service still lived within her. The early mornings, the late nights, the endless challenges. She had joined the army when she was barely out of high school, a young woman with dreams of making something of herself in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. The military had given her a chance to prove herself, not just to others, but to herself. Patricia had risen quickly through the ranks, gaining respect from her peers and superiors alike. but it hadn't been easy. As one of the few black women in her unit, she often found herself at the center of attention, but for all the wrong reasons. It was the whispered doubts, the sideways glances, and the constant question of whether she was there because of her abilities or her skin color. It was the subtle and not so subtle ways that people tested her, doubted her every move, and challenged her authority, simply because she wasn't like them. But Patricia had never let those things stop her. She had learned early on that if she wanted to succeed, she had to work twice as hard, be twice as strong, and be twice as good as anyone else. And so she had done just that. She had become a logistics officer, a job that required precision, efficiency, and an ability to think under pressure. And think, Patricia did, through countless high-stakes situations, through long deployments in war zones, through times when she had feared for her life and the lives of those around her. She had excelled, earning medals and commendations along the way, but most importantly, earning the respect of those who had doubted her from the start. Now, years later, as she walked through the streets of her small town, Patricia couldn't help but think about all of those years of sacrifice and service. How had they led her here, to this courthouse, facing a fine for a simple mistake that she was sure could have been handled with understanding? Why did people still see her as something less than what she had worked so hard to become? She felt tired, worn out from constantly fighting to be seen, to be respected. But she wouldn't let the fine define her. She refused to let it take away from the years of pride she had earned through her service. As she rounded the corner and headed toward her car, Patricia took a deep breath and promised herself that she would never stop fighting for what was right, not just for herself, but for all the women and men like her who had been overlooked, misunderstood, and dismissed. This fine, this moment, it would be a small battle in the grand scheme of things. But she would fight it, and she would continue to fight for what she believed in, no matter how many courts she had to stand in front of. That evening, Judge Ronald Hayes sat in his study, staring at the pile of case files scattered across his desk. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but his mind remained heavy with the day's decisions. He had always prided himself on being fair, on adhering to the law without bias. But today, something about Patricia Johnson's case gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than what had met his eye in the courtroom. He glanced at her file again, the details of her violation, just a simple traffic mistake. Yet something felt off. He had handed down a fine without a second thought, just as he always had, relying on the assumption that the case was straightforward. She had seemed calm, composed even, but there was an odd sense of dignity about her that struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As he reached for his coffee, his eyes drifted to the corner of his desk where a stack of files lay waiting for his attention. One file in particular caught his eye, Patricia Johnson's. He hesitated before pulling it closer, wondering why he hadn't thought to look deeper before making his ruling. Normally, he would have done a quick search on anyone in his courtroom with a criminal history, but Patricia hadn't appeared to have one. Still, there was something that bothered him. He opened her file and began reading, skimming over the details of the case. It didn't take long before something caught his attention. The name was familiar, too familiar. With a growing sense of unease, he pulled up her full record, researching her background online. As the pages loaded, Judge Hayes' breath caught in his throat. What he found was far more than he had expected. Patricia Johnson wasn't just a woman with a simple traffic violation. She was a decorated U.S. Army veteran with an impressive list of commendations to her name. The Bronze Star, Meritorious Service Medal, Army Commendation Medals, and more. She had served as a logistics officer, managing critical operations in war zones, and had been recognized for her leadership and courage. Judge Hayes felt his stomach twist. The woman he had so casually dismissed, the woman he had fined without a second thought, had spent years serving her country, putting her life on the line. How had he missed this? How had he overlooked the quiet strength in her eyes, the one thing that made her stand out, even if only for a brief moment in the courtroom? The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had judged her based on nothing more than appearances. His assumptions about her based on her race, gender, and even her calm demeanor had led him to make a hasty decision, one that he now deeply regretted. He couldn't ignore the shame he felt creeping up on him. How could he have been so blind, so quick to judge a woman who had earned her place in the world through hard work, sacrifice, and bravery? The weight of his mistake settled heavily on him, and he found himself staring at the screen, almost paralyzed with the awareness of what he had done. It wasn't just the fine, it was the way he had dehumanized her, reduced her to a mere violation in a system that didn't see her as anything more than a case number. How many others had he treated the same way without even knowing their stories? How many had slipped through the cracks of his judgment? His mind raced. There was no easy way to undo the damage, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this stand. Patricia Johnson deserved better. She deserved an apology, but more than that, she deserved recognition. He had to make it right. As he stared at her file, Judge Hayes made a vow to himself. He would find a way to correct his mistake, to show Patricia and the world that he could be better than the assumptions he had once made. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone. The next morning, Judge Hayes couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of regret. The events of the previous day had played over and over in his mind, each time a reminder of the mistake he had made. He couldn't simply let it go. It wasn't the type of error that could be forgotten or brushed aside. His usual confidence felt hollow now, and he had to make it right, not just for Patricia, but for himself as well. He could no longer pretend he was the same person he had been the day before. Judge Hayes knew that an apology alone wouldn't suffice. He had wronged someone who had given more to the country than most people ever would. And it wasn't just the fine that bothered him. It was the way he had dismissed her humanity, the way he had seen her as just another case, just another file to sort through. He had to do more. He needed to make a meaningful change, something that would go beyond just his courtroom. He sat down at his desk, the room suddenly feeling too small, too stifling. The phone sat next to him, silent and waiting. He took a deep breath, then picked it up. First, he called his clerk, instructing her to pull up the contact information for Patricia Johnson. He needed to speak with her directly. There was no other way. He couldn't just send a letter or make an announcement from the bench. He had to look her in the eye and show her that he understood the gravity of his mistake. As he waited for the call to be connected, Judge Hayes found himself thinking back to his own past, to the times when he had been on the receiving end of judgment. He had been a young man, a product of his own small-town upbringing, where the expectations were narrow and anything outside of the norm was treated with suspicion. His path to becoming a judge had been a hard one. He had spent years building his career, trying to prove himself to people who doubted him, just as Patricia had spent years proving herself in the military. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, but even then, he had never been subjected to the same level of scrutiny and prejudice that Patricia must have faced every day of her life. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, and that was exactly the problem. He hadn't tried to understand. The phone rang. "Hello, this is Judge Hayes," he said, his voice softer than usual. "May I speak with Mrs. Patricia Johnson, please?" A moment later, a calm voice answered, and for a brief second, he wasn't sure how to begin. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about acknowledging a deeper truth that he had failed to see before. "Ms. Johnson, I hope you're well. I know this may come as a surprise, but I wanted to reach out to you personally regarding yesterday's hearing." There was a pause on the other end, a brief silence that felt like an eternity. "I want to begin by offering my sincerest apology for the way I handled your case. I made a judgment about you without knowing who you truly are, and I deeply regret that decision." He could feel the sincerity in his own voice, the weight of the words. "I was wrong, and I want to make it right." Patricia was quiet for a long moment before she spoke, her voice steady. "Judge Hayes, I appreciate your words, but honestly, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to hear from you at all." "I understand," he replied, "but I've spent the night reflecting on what I missed. Your service to our country, your sacrifices, those deserve recognition, not dismissal. I've learned more about you since yesterday, and I realize how wrong I was." There was a long pause before Patricia spoke again. "What do you plan to do about it?" "I want to meet with you," he said without hesitation. "I want to hear your story, the one I should have been listening to in the courtroom." I also plan to make a public statement acknowledging my mistake and creating a better process for recognizing veterans like yourself who might be overlooked. You deserve more than just an apology." The words felt like a small step toward redemption, but Judge Hayes knew it was the first of many. He would have to prove his commitment with more than just promises. He was ready for that challenge. Patricia sighed softly. "All right, Judge. Let's meet. I think we both have a lot to say." As they set up a time to meet, Judge Hayes felt a sense of relief begin to wash over him. It wouldn't be easy, but this was the beginning of a much-needed change, both for him and for the way he viewed the world. A mistake had been made, but it was one that could be corrected if he was willing to truly listen and learn. And he was. The meeting was set for the following week, and as the days passed, Judge Hayes found himself feeling both nervous and determined. He had spent his life making decisions, but this was different. This wasn't about ruling on a case, it was about confronting his own biases and misunderstandings. He knew that Patricia Johnson had seen things in a way he hadn't, and he couldn't just apologize and expect things to be fine. He needed to understand her experiences, and how they shaped the woman who stood before him in that courtroom. Patricia, on the other hand, wasn't sure what to expect. When she had received the call from Judge Hayes, she was taken aback. After being judged and fined in an instant, the last thing she expected was an apology. She had almost hung up when he first mentioned his regret, but something in his voice made her hesitate. She had heard the sincerity, the acknowledgement that he had made a mistake. But would it be enough to erase the feeling of being dismissed, of having been seen only as a black woman with a traffic ticket, rather than as someone who had sacrificed so much for her country? When the day finally arrived, Patricia dressed carefully. She chose a simple black dress, the kind she might wear to a ceremony or a formal event. She wasn't sure what kind of meeting this would be, but she wanted to appear poised and respectful. As she drove to the courthouse, she found herself replaying the events from the past week. The phone call with Judge Hayes hadn't been easy, but she appreciated the fact that he had reached out. Still, something inside her told her to remain cautious. Apologies were easy, but change was harder to come by. As she entered the courthouse, she felt a sense of déjà vu. The same walls, the same waiting areas, the same air of authority that had surrounded her only days before. But today it felt different. Today she wasn't just a defendant. Today she was a woman with a story to tell. She walked into the judge's chambers, where Hayes was waiting for her. He rose when she entered, his expression soft but still serious. "Ms. Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Patricia hesitated for a moment but shook his hand. "Thank you for reaching out," she replied. There was no warmth in her voice, but there was no hostility either. She was trying to keep an open mind, but she wasn't going to let him off easily. "Please have a seat." Hayes gestured to the chair opposite his desk. As she sat down, he took his own seat, leaning forward slightly. "I know that words alone can't undo what happened, but I want to be clear that I deeply regret my decision. I didn't take the time to understand who you are and what you've done." Patricia nodded, watching him carefully. "I appreciate you saying that," she said slowly. "But you have to understand, Judge, it's not just about the fine. It's about the way I was treated, like I was just another number, another violation in a long line of cases. You didn't take a moment to ask why I was there or who I was. You didn't see me." Judge Hayes' face tightened and he looked down at the desk, clearly processing her words. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't see you. I saw a case to be closed, a fine to be issued. And in doing so, I overlooked everything that makes you who you are. Your service, your sacrifice, your strength. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." For a moment, there was silence. Patricia took a breath, feeling the weight of his words, but she wasn't ready to forgive him just yet. "You know," she began, "I spent years in the military, working with men and women who didn't always believe in me, didn't always believe I deserved to be there. Every day I had to prove myself, not just because of my abilities, but because of the color of my skin. I've been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed my whole life. And yesterday, you did the same thing. You assumed who I was without asking." Hayes nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I'm sorry for adding to that burden," he said quietly. I know I can't undo the damage, but I want to change. I want to make sure that something like this never happens again. Patricia watched him carefully, her gaze unwavering. That's a start, she said finally, her voice softening just slightly. But words only go so far. If you really want to make it right, you need to take action. You need to do something more than just apologize. I will, Hayes said, his voice firm. I've already begun working on new procedures in my courtroom. I want to ensure that every veteran, every person who walks through my doors, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. And I'll be making a public statement about my mistake, about what I've learned, and what needs to change. Patricia sat back in her chair, still unsure of what to think. She appreciated the words, but only time would tell if they meant anything. Still, there was something in the judge's voice that made her believe this might be more than just a fleeting gesture. For the first time since the courtroom, she felt like she might have been heard. All right, she said finally. I'll hold you to it. With that, the two sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. It wasn't over, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed their meeting, Judge Hayes kept his word. He didn't just apologize publicly. He took concrete steps to ensure that the mistake he had made with Patricia Johnson wouldn't happen again. First, he worked with his court staff to develop a more thorough vetting process for cases involving veterans. No longer would a simple traffic violation be treated as just another line in a stack of cases. He implemented a system where each veteran's background and service would be checked before any decision was made, ensuring that their sacrifices were acknowledged, no matter how small or large the case seemed. Patricia heard about the changes through a friend in the local community, a fellow veteran who had attended a town hall where Judge Hayes spoke about his new approach. The judge had not only discussed the adjustments in his courtroom, but also shared his personal reflection on how the mistake had impacted him. He openly admitted to his past biases and the way they had shaped his decisions. It was rare to see such vulnerability in someone who had spent years as a figure of authority, and it did not go unnoticed. Though Patricia didn't attend the town hall herself, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, but it was there. The community was talking about it, talking about change, talking about how easy it was to judge others without knowing their story. She could hear people speaking with more awareness of the struggles that veterans, especially veterans of color, faced. There was more of an effort to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. Patricia was cautiously optimistic, but she remained wary. Words were easy. Action was the real test. Then, one afternoon, Judge Hayes called her again. This time, his tone was different. Ms. Johnson, I wanted to invite you to an event I'm hosting at the courthouse. It's a recognition ceremony for veterans, especially those who have been overlooked in the past. I'd like to personally honor you for your service and your courage, both in the military and in helping me see the mistakes I made. Would you consider coming? Patricia was surprised. She hadn't expected anything like this. After all, she had never been someone who sought recognition. She had done her job in the military because it was her duty, not for the medals, not for the accolades. But this was different. It wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. It was about the recognition of all the veterans who had been dismissed, forgotten, or ignored. I'd be honored to attend, Judge, she replied, her voice steady but tinged with a sense of disbelief. The day of the event arrived, and Patricia stood in front of the courthouse, taking a moment to gather herself. The building that had once been a place of frustration and judgment now felt different. It felt like a space for healing, a space for reflection. When she walked inside, she saw a group of veterans standing together, chatting quietly. There were men and women of all ages, some in their uniforms, some dressed in civilian clothes, all with stories written across their faces. Judge Hayes stood at the front of the room, waiting for her. When he saw her, he smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. Ms. Johnson, he said, stepping forward, thank you for being here. Your presence today means more than I can express. The ceremony began shortly after, with Judge Hayes speaking about the importance of recognizing the service and sacrifice of veterans, particularly those who had been overlooked or marginalized. He spoke about how he had learned from his mistake and how it had inspired him to create a system that would better serve those who had given so much to their country. As he spoke, Patricia felt her heart swell with a quiet pride. It wasn't just for herself, but for all the veterans in the room. Veterans who had, like her, fought against stereotypes, against assumptions, and against the system that had often treated them as less than. When it was Patricia's turn, she walked to the front of the room, feeling the eyes of everyone on her. Judge Hayes handed her a certificate of recognition, and for the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not for the color of her skin, not for her gender, but for the life she had lived and the service she had given. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you for recognizing us. We've always been here, always been serving, and now we're finally being heard." The room erupted in applause, and Patricia felt the weight of the moment settle in. It was more than a ceremony. It was a declaration of change, of understanding, of justice finally taking the form it should have all along. After the ceremony, Judge Hayes approached her again. "I'm grateful, Ms. Johnson, for the opportunity to learn from you." She smiled at him, a rare, genuine smile that spoke volumes. "It's not just about me, Judge. It's about all of us, the ones who are finally being seen." And for the first time, Patricia believed it was true. She was being seen. They all were. The recognition ceremony marked a turning point, but Patricia knew that the work wasn't finished. For all the progress made, there was still a long road ahead. The recognition from Judge Hayes, the community, and the veterans who had gathered in that room. It was meaningful, but it was only the beginning. She had witnessed how one person's change could ripple outward, but she was keenly aware that lasting change needed more than just good intentions. It required sustained effort, and that effort was something that had to be carried forward by everyone, not just Judge Hayes. In the following weeks, Patricia found herself more involved in local veteran organizations, where she began to speak about her experiences, not just as a veteran, but as a Black woman who had navigated both the military and the civilian world. Her story resonated deeply with others who had been similarly overlooked, who had struggled to be seen beyond the stereotypes that society often imposed on them. She realized that every time she shared her story, she was pushing back against the system that had tried to ignore her. She wasn't just advocating for herself anymore. She was advocating for all those who had walked in her shoes. One evening, Patricia was invited to speak at a community event. The topic was about race, service, and the challenges veterans face when they returned home. It was being hosted by a local nonprofit that aimed to create a more inclusive space for veterans of all backgrounds. Patricia had spoken at events before, but this one felt different. She knew that her words had the potential to spark something bigger, to inspire more people to think critically about how veterans, especially veterans of color, were treated once they returned to civilian life. As she stood at the podium, Patricia felt the weight of her experiences settle into her bones. She spoke about the challenges she had faced during her time in the military, how the color of her skin had often made her a target for doubt, how she had fought not only on the battlefield, but against the prejudices that followed her everywhere. She spoke about Judge Hayes and the day he had apologized to her. But more than anything, she spoke about the work that still needed to be done. "We can't change the past," she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "But we can change how we treat each other moving forward. We can choose to see each other as human beings with stories, with struggles, with triumphs, not as stereotypes, not as statistics." Her words rang out across the room, and for the first time, she felt like people were truly listening. After her speech, there were tears, there were nods of agreement, and most importantly, there were conversations, real conversations, about how to better support veterans and how to break down the barriers of prejudice that still linger in the world. It wasn't just about veterans' benefits or recognition. It was about respect, dignity, and equality. The audience didn't just applaud her. They asked questions. They wanted to learn. They wanted to act. The next day, Judge Hayes called her again. "I saw you speak last night," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You were incredible." Patricia smiled faintly, a quiet pride filling her. "Thank you, Judge. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about changing the way we see each other." "I know," he replied, "and that's exactly why I want to invite you to join a task force on creating." It's focused on ensuring that veterans from all backgrounds are treated with respect and given the support they deserve. We're going to take this beyond the courtroom. We want to change policy, change perception. You're a key part of that. Patricia's heart swelled at his words. It was an offer she hadn't expected, one that would put her in a position to help lead the change she had spoken about. This wasn't just about sitting at a table and offering ideas. It was about shaping the future for veterans, about having a hand in ensuring they were seen and heard long after they had put on their uniforms. She didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said without a second thought. "I'll be part of the task force. Let's make sure this is a movement, not just a moment." As the conversation ended, Patricia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work ahead would be difficult, but it was necessary. She knew that the road to change was never easy, but with each step, she was making a difference, not just for herself, but for all those who had fought for the freedom to be seen, to be respected, and to be heard. And as the days turned into months, Patricia found herself at the forefront of something bigger than she had ever imagined. Something that was no longer about a single mistake, but about a community that was rising together, determined to create a world where every veteran, no matter their background, was valued and appreciated. The change had begun, and it was only growing stronger. Months passed, and the changes Patricia and Judge Hayes had started continued to gain momentum. The task force they formed, composed of veterans, community leaders, and policymakers, began pushing through meaningful reforms. Together, they worked on legislation to improve support for veterans, especially those from marginalized communities. They advocated for more accessible mental health resources, expanded job training programs, and increased efforts to reduce homelessness among veterans. But perhaps the most significant achievement was the change in the way veterans were perceived, not just by the court system, but by society as a whole. Patricia found herself working closely with Judge Hayes and others, building a network of support for those who had been overlooked for so long. She traveled to meetings across the state, speaking to groups of veterans and civilians alike, telling her story and urging them to see the humanity in every person who had served. The initiative gained national attention as the media began to cover the shift in both public opinion and policy. Veterans, particularly veterans of color who had been silenced for too long, were now finding a platform to share their experiences and be heard. Despite the progress, the work wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of resistance, of people who refused to acknowledge that systemic issues of race and inequality still existed in the military and the way veterans were treated. But Patricia, with Judge Hayes by her side, remained steadfast. They continued to push forward, making it clear that this movement was about more than just policy. It was about changing hearts and minds. One afternoon, months after that first meeting with Judge Hayes, they stood together once again in a ceremony, this time honoring not only veterans, but also the community members who had supported their efforts. The event was held at a large convention center, and there was a palpable sense of pride in the air. Patricia walked into the room, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for how far they had come. What had started as an apology had blossomed into something much larger than she had ever imagined, a movement that was touching lives across the country. Judge Hayes stood at the podium, his voice strong and clear as he addressed the crowd. "Today, we celebrate the incredible contributions of our veterans, men and women who have given so much for this country," he began, "but we also recognize the importance of understanding and empathy. We recognize the need to see beyond labels, beyond stereotypes, and to truly understand the experiences of those who have served." Patricia stood off to the side, watching him with a quiet smile. She had seen this man, this judge, transformed from someone who had made a mistake into someone who was genuinely dedicated to making a difference. He had been willing to change, to admit his faults, and to use his position to create change that would benefit countless others. And in doing so, he had helped inspire others to take action. When it was Patricia's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady as she addressed the audience. "We are all here today because we believe in a better future, a future where veterans are treated with respect, where they are given the resources they need to succeed after they've served, and where their stories are not overlooked. This is only the beginning. We've come far, but there is still much work to be done." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in her life, Patricia felt like her service wasn't just appreciated, it was understood. She had spent so many years fighting to be seen, to be valued, but now she knew that her fight had meant something. Not just for her, but for every veteran who had ever been dismissed or ignored. As the event concluded, Patricia and Judge Hayes walked together toward the exit, their conversation quiet but meaningful. "You've done something extraordinary, Ms. Johnson," he said. "None of this would have happened without your willingness to challenge the system and speak out."